All right, how's everybody this morning? Yeah? You're beautiful. No, seriously. You're ugly. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I never want to see you again. You're guilty. You're innocent. You're a sinner. You're a saint. I hate you. I love you. Words have immense power, do they not? Some of you, sorry if you thought I was talking to you being beautiful or ugly specifically. But I wanted to demonstrate that words have immense power. You know, it's funny, when we were growing up, all of us through school, we learned that there's such things as words, obviously, and we learned that words have definitions. And a teacher might have said to us early on in our elementary school days, hey, you guys need to take these words and you need to write out what the definition is. And so we knew that we were the ones to kind of give words definitions based on what we understood. But the more that life has gone on, what we've actually seen is that words can give definition to us, right? And so the amazing thing to me is how life-giving or how it can bring death. Just a matter of words, and certainly the tone that comes with those words. We're looking for the perfect words. I think all of the time. I honestly don't know of anything more powerful, both as a giver of words and a receiver of words. Both as a giver and receiver of very positive words, and a giver or receiver of negative words. In fact, I don't want you to close your eyes because I don't want anybody falling asleep just yet. But if I had you and I close our eyes and I just asked you to think about what are the 5 words that you've heard throughout your history that were the most painful. My guess is, if you're like me, you wouldn't have a difficult time coming up with those words. And as those words and those memories begin to evoke some emotion within you, I can only imagine we might think, golly, man, it can define us, right? Words are huge. In fact, words, I think, are one of the reasons we look for the perfect greeting card, right? I mean, you guys, men, you do know you just don't grab one off the shelf, right? You just don't do that. The fact that words are so powerful, I think it's the reason why my wife, and she's amazing at this, but she writes every one of our kids an illustrated story for every one of their birthdays. I just go old school and write a black and white letter, and I hope that's significant too. But the reason she does it and the reason I do it is because we know that words are incredibly powerful. I think God knows how powerful words are. It's amazing when you think about the word word or the word words when it comes to God. I think God knows the power of words. I think that's why he spoke creation into being. I think part of Jesus becoming human was so that he might speak into our existence. In fact, the man who wrote the Gospel of John, obviously John, he says in chapter 1, he's talking about Jesus and he says, the Word became flesh. Words are powerful. You might know that as Christians, or you may have never heard this, but Christians refer to the Bible oftentimes as the Word of God because the Word is powerful, especially when it's an authoritative word. And you know the power of words, whether you've been the giver of those words or the receiver, whether they've been incredibly positive and someone has just kind of made your day because of the words they spoke to you, or whether someone had this ability to damage you just because of their words. In fact, if you want to further study on words, I would just recommend James chapter 3 to you. James is a writer. He just writes a lot about just how powerful words are and how that when they're used as evil, words are like powerful poison. And the power of the words, you guys know this, right? I mean, words are incredibly powerful. And as we continue the Tell Me Who I Am series, what we've done so far is we would get to a topic like money or relationships or your past or your failures or your successes. And what I would say to you is, hey, don't allow your life to be defined by whatever the topic was. Everybody familiar with that? No. Yes. Especially those of you that have been here a few weeks. Well, you might assume this morning that as we're talking about words, you might expect me to say, knowing how we've done this series so far, you might expect me to say, hey, don't allow your life to be defined by the words of others. And you would be right. And you would be wrong. Right? I want you guys, if you have a Bible, to open up to Luke chapter 7. If you need a Bible, just raise your hand. We would love to distribute one to you. Just keep your hand up high. Our volunteers will place one in your hands, and I'll give you the page number that will be on in those gift Bibles. This is yours to keep. If you get one of those Bibles, or if you use one of those week to week, we're on page 561. For the rest of us, Luke chapter 7, Luke is one of the 4 what are known as the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Luke chapter 7, this is one of those stories I've taught on a couple of times already in our short history here at Epic, because I believe that the foundational principles in this story that Jesus is a part of and a couple of other people are a part of, I believe it's just powerful. And I want you to hear this this morning. If you would stand with me as we read together, you'll have the verses on the screen. 15 verses, Luke 7, 36 through 50. It's going to go faster than 15 verses seem, okay? It's a story. We're not going to weight you down. But I feel like we need to get the weight of it. And you'll see this on the screen. It starts Luke 7, starting in verse 36. And Jesus is in the story, surprise. And there's a Pharisee in the story named Simon. And there's a woman in the story who doesn't have a name except she goes by sinner. Wouldn't you love that tagline? Like, oh, look, here comes the sinner. There's the town sinner. That's kind of who she gets declared as being. John 7, 36 through 50. One of the Pharisees asked him, Jesus, to eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with ointment. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher. A certain moneylender had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you have judged rightly. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Then those who were at table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. You may be seated. Such an interesting story to me, I think, this encounter that Jesus has. So Jesus is going to the home of this Pharisee named Simon. And one of the things that you need to know is that, and you can probably tell from the text, but Simon doesn't think Jesus is any different than Simon is. He thinks he's a prophet, or so he's been told. And he just thinks that both of them are pretty religious people. The Pharisee really is, we'll talk more about this next week, but a Pharisee is someone who kind of on the outside seemed to have it all together. They obeyed the laws of God. They had this great knowledge of the law of God. They always had this cleanliness approach to life. It seemed like they had their act together. They were the ones who were strictly adhering to the law. They made sure that all of their ducks were in a row. I mean, they just had on the outside this appearance that they had everything right with God, and then essentially that God should be happy because of the lives that they've lived. God should accept them. God should they should be righteous or declared righteous simply because of how well they had gotten things together. And this woman, she's kind of the opposite, isn't she? I mean, you've got the religious person, and then you got a woman. I mean, again, how would you like your name, your title, the word that hung over your life to be sinner? Everybody good with that? I mean, just start calling hopefully you don't call your boss that tomorrow, but just start saying that to people, and you would be amazed, I think, at the response. Now, here's what's interesting. As we begin to talk about the power of words and whether or not they define you, you might think that your pastor would say this morning, hey, don't let people say things that aren't true about you. That's the lesson from this story, but that isn't the lesson from the story. Was this woman a sinner? Huh? She was, right? Let me give you 3 accounts from 3 different people's point of view. First of all, Luke is the writer of this. He writes the book of Luke, surprise. He also writes the book of Acts. Luke is the author. Luke is just simply giving facts like a good reporter would do. If you look at verse 37, this isn't in italics, or this isn't in quotes. This isn't in red letters. If you have the words of Jesus in red letters, this is what Luke says in verse 37. He's just making an observation about this woman. Here's what he says. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner. Is she a sinner? Yes, it's not speculation. It's not a title the Pharisee gave her and made it true about her. It's not something the Pharisee said about her that wasn't true. What the Pharisee said about her was absolutely true. In fact, Luke says it. You know who else says it? Jesus says it about this woman. Look at 47. If we could have 47 up there. Here's what Jesus says. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are... Is she a sinner? Yes. And does the Pharisee Simon think she's a sinner? Now listen, when you've got an unbiased author, the Son of God, and a religious person declaring this woman to be a sinner, my bets are on the fact that she was a... Yeah. Right? I mean, let's don't just say that, man, the Pharisee's calling her a sinner. He's got the problem. He's got a problem, but not because he recognizes who she is, because Jesus recognizes that she is that. Luke, this unbiased author, recognizes that she is that. Something for you and I to understand. It's not that when people say things about us that are negative, it's not always that those things aren't true. Right? And let's be honest, it's a lot easier for us to get over things people say about us when they're not true, right? I mean, they sting a little bit, but if someone, let's say that you saw something out there on a blog or about yourself or something like that, or someone said something to you in a group of people or in some company staff meeting, and it wasn't true, it would still sting, wouldn't it? But it stings even more when they say it and we absolutely know it's true, right? Like I've got no argument. You're right. These three men weren't the only one in the room who knew this woman was a sinner. In fact, we all tend to know the best and, well, usually just the worst about ourselves, don't we? So you've got really four people observing, and they're all unanimous, right? Luke, this woman was a sinner. The Pharisee, if Jesus knew what sort of woman this was, what sort of woman is she? She's a sinner. Jesus himself says this woman had many sins, and the woman, she knows. So this isn't about, hey, don't let people speak false things about you. It's the question is, will people be able to define us? Will our acts be able to define us? And will we ourselves, based on what we've done and who we've been, will that define us? That's the question. The question isn't, are we sinners? Okay, can we agree on that? The question isn't, do you have a short list or a long list? I'm not interested in that. Every one of us in this room have a list. Right? She has a long one. The Pharisee seems to have a short one. We'll get to him in a second. And here's what you need to know. The reason that the Pharisee approached Jesus and had him over, the Pharisee would only have people over who were probably like him. And he didn't know Jesus as a savior type yet. He knew him as a religious teacher type. And so that put them in the Pharisee's mind on the same playing field. So him and Jesus are equals. Now, what's interesting, when he sees that Jesus is allowing the sinful woman to be present and to do the things and to worship Jesus and to show love to Jesus, when the Pharisee sees this, all of a sudden, Jesus goes down in his mind. Does that make sense? He says, if this man were really a prophet, he would know what sort of woman this is. Isn't that crazy? So not only is he not looking up to Jesus to begin with, he's looking kind of eye to eye. And all of a sudden, when you see in verse 39, and of course, Jesus reads this man's heart just like he reads our hearts, right? Which can be an exciting thing sometimes, but oftentimes a scary thing. Jesus reads this man's heart, and you can see what he says about Jesus in his heart. He says, if this man were a prophet, verse 39, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. You know what the Pharisee deduced, and sometimes we do the same? There's no way Jesus would allow this to take place if he was actually familiar with this woman's life. Sometimes the thing we're afraid of most is that people would become familiar with us, right? In romantic relationships and in friendships and in your city you live in, a lot of times when people begin to become familiar with us, we take off running to a new place, don't we? At worst, or maybe even at best, we build this invisible fence and don't let anyone into our personal space. Why? Because the truth is, the more someone gets to know you and the more someone gets to know me, they're going to know the dark side, aren't they? I'll never forget the first time that I went home to meet Shauna's parents. Shauna's my wife of 12 years now. But when I went to meet her parents, the first time I was with them, I was there for a week or a week and a half. And before I flew home, I'll never forget her mom. And I felt so good about this. And it's so funny now, but I'll never forget her mom said, now, Ben, you might not be perfect, but I sure haven't seen it yet. Like, this is awesome. She wouldn't say that this morning, all right? That would not be her confession this morning. That is not on her Facebook status. She has not messaged me with that. We have a great relationship, but I'll never forget that. And the reason why is because, listen, we can all throw the image out there in the beginning, right? And the reality is, even when it's true about us, what a stranger says about us doesn't impact us nearly as much as the people who are most familiar with us, right? Like you can imagine, as a pastor of this church, I get stuff all the time. Great, positive, encouraging stuff. I get my fair share of criticism. I get a lot of things. And all those things impact me. But getting a letter or an email from someone who doesn't know me has some impact on me, but not the impact my wife or my great friends have on me when they say something. Does that make sense? And so the people that are most familiar with us, as they begin to label us, they can tend to do the most damage with us. So the Pharisee begins to think the only reason Jesus is letting this go on, he doesn't know her story. Did he know her story? He knows her story, right? He's going to say, he's not going to say she's a sinner. He's going to just go, hey, yeah, she's done it a bunch. She's done many sins. She's done it a bunch. He knows her story. Sometimes what you and I think is that, man, if he wasn't, and sometimes we don't want to even consider that there is a God who is A, holy, and then B, a God who's familiar with us, because we think the only way that he would like us is if he wasn't too familiar with us. Right? I mean, think about it. You don't give your worst events of your life to the lady or the man on your first date, do you? I hope not. Right? Why? Because we know chances are there wouldn't be a second one. When it comes to the issue of faith, some of us are much better off with a God who is unfamiliar with us. Some of us are much better off with a God who doesn't know the dark spots. We've hid it from all humans. We think if we could hide it from this God, then man, we might could get off on the right foot. And so the Pharisees is going, Jesus, you're clueless. And Jesus begins to tell this story, starting in verse 41. And here's the story. He says there's a moneylender, and he had two people that owed him money. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. Now, just so we know, for value's sake, a denarii is worth about 1 day's wages back then. And so don't say it out loud, but just think about what your salary is on a daily basis. One person owed 50 days' salary. The other person owed 500 days' salary. Okay, so about 1.5 years of your salary, that's what one owed. The other one owed about 2 months or so of your salary, if you just get that kind of context in mind. So that's what they owe. And again, what's crazy, and the Pharisee's still not understanding that he's the one who owes 50 in the story. He wouldn't think he owed anything, by the way. Before Jesus tells the story, he doesn't think he's in debt at all, right? And what Jesus is saying, hey, you may not have the list she has, but he's saying you both have a list. Now, verse 42 is the verse I think that really is the center point of the parable Jesus tells. Because if you don't recognize this, if the Pharisee didn't recognize this, if the woman didn't recognize this, if we don't recognize this, we're not going to really understand what Jesus is up to. Jesus says this phrase to start off 42. He says, when they could not pay. When they could not pay. You have to remember the Pharisee, before the story is told by Jesus, the Pharisee thinks the woman is the only one who's in debt. Does that make sense? Remember, there's really two kinds of people when it comes to religion, right? It's the self-righteous religious person, or it's the very irreligious person. In fact, Luke 15, the prodigal son, really gets at the heart of this. The older brother is the self-righteous one. And which one, by the way, well, I won't ask you, but I'll just tell you, as I continue to grow, hopefully older, you want to grow older, or otherwise the other option's bad. But as I continue to grow older, it seems to me I have less patience with religious people than I do irreligious people. And by religious, I don't mean the good kind of religion. I mean like the bad kind where people think they're self-righteous. People, they check their name off the list. They know everything. They kind of do the Pharisee thing, as you see Simon played out in the story. And it's interesting that the people who are religious, the problem with them is that they never see their need. They think they've earned it. They think they've arrived at some place. And you can see this. So what Jesus says, it says, hey, when they both could not pay, that's a huge part. But the next part's huge too. And of course, Jesus is the moneylender in the story. It says, when they both could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Which of them will love him more? Which of them is going to be most grateful? Which of them is going to have much love? Because here's what the Pharisee knows. He knows the woman's got a long list, but he doesn't even recognize the fact that he's got a list. And so he knows that she's a sinner, and Jesus is letting him know, hey, the reason why she's doing this extravagant thing is because she understands. When they both could not pay. This is our story as well. The reality in the room this morning is this, okay? And thankfully, we're not going to have it on the screen. If we could take the screen and just roll through every person in this room, our list would be different size, right? And I'm pretty sure when it goes to the least amount of sins, I'm not winning gold, silver, or bronze, or honorable mention, or probably not even qualifying, right? But if we could just see the list, like you had your list, and then I have my list, and you're the person next to you. And so what we would want to do is to leave this room going, man, I'm in the top 10 of least amount of sins in human history. This is awesome, right? That's what we do, isn't it? Isn't that tell me who I am? I just want to know where I stack up against you. The problem with the Pharisee is that he knew where he stacked up against the woman, but Jesus was trying to say, hey, man, that's not the point. It's not the point for you either. Here's the deal. Who cares how long the list is? That's not the question. The question is has Jesus done anything with your list, no matter how short or long it is? Let me say this. It would be better to be a terrible sinner who had their debt canceled than to be a light sinner who still had the debt. Do you see what he's getting after, the heart of the story? She's a sinner. She knows it. Luke knows it. The Pharisee knows it. Jesus knows it. The Pharisee's a sinner too. And everybody knows it but him. Everybody knows it but him. That's his reality. And so the woman, she begins to hear Jesus say this to her. If you look at verse 47, Jesus says, therefore I tell you, her sins, which are what? Many, are forgiven. Words matter, don't they? Do you think her hearing that from Jesus made any impact as her life moved forward? Words matter. Now, her reputation, she was a sinner. She absolutely was. And the funny thing to me is she ends up with a relationship with Jesus, and this religious guy misses out on it. Isn't that incredible? Like, he's been so good. He's brought his A game most days. He knows the whole law. He's memorized Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He knows all of it. She only knows that she's a sinner in need of mercy, and she gets in on a relationship with Jesus. And this religious man, unless his life changes, unless his heart changes, he misses out. This isn't to say that those of us who do the right kinds of things and are good moral people, it's not to say that we're bad people, right? In fact, just the opposite. Most of us are good people if we live that life. But if we don't recognize the need in our own heart to trust in someone, to ask forgiveness for our sins, if we don't recognize that need, then people who have a much longer list of sins are going to be in a much better place with Jesus than you and I are. The Pharisee, I mean, it's crazy to me, but he thought he had earned a right standing with God. The sinner woman knew that she couldn't. This Pharisee thought he had no need of grace. This woman knew her only hope was grace. The Pharisee thought he didn't owe anyone. The woman knew she could not pay what she owed. And the question is, does your heart resemble the Pharisee, or does it resemble the sinful woman? Your heart. What does it resemble? Now, Jesus says to her, the reason that she he says to her, her many sins are forgiven, for she loved much. And if you took that just at face value, you would think the reason that her sins were forgiven because she was a loving woman. That's not what he's saying. It's the opposite of that cause-effect relationship. What he's saying is the reason she loves much, the reason why she would go buy this expensive alabaster jar, the reason why she's doing this thing that seems so incredibly extravagant, the reason she would do that is because she understands that there's a God who's holy. She knows what her story is, but she also knows that's not the end of her story. And it doesn't have to be the end of your story either. What are the words that have been the most painful for you to hear? Don't answer it out loud. But I want you to think about what are those words? And by the way, who gets to define us? Is it a boss? Do our friends get to define us with their words? Do our parents get to define us with their words? Do our ex-lovers get to define us with their words? And you might expect, because it's so prevalent in today's culture, you might expect me to say, hey, no, you need to define yourself. Now, you've lived with yourself long enough, right? Do you trust yourself, really? Isn't it amazing one day we can wake up feeling like we're God's gift to humanity, and the next reason we don't know why we were ever born? And like the next day? Don't trust yourself. You will not hear that from your pastor. It's hard because I'm a thinker, but I'm a feeler also. Like, I want to feel things. I want to feel confident. I want to feel passionate. I want to feel strong. But if I've learned anything lately, especially in this series, like, don't trust your feelings. And don't trust yourself. You know why? Because I don't always see reality. And I don't have the authority to speak into every situation. And so what I need and what you need is what this woman needed and what the Pharisee needed, though he didn't know it. We need someone who speaks with clarity, speaks into reality, and speaks with authority. Because here's the deal. Whatever word tells you who you are, right? If it's forgiveness or if it's sinner. If it's beautiful or if it's ugly. If it's incompetent or if it's talented. Whoever speaks the word that you end up living out of, that person's your master. Whether it's a coach from 15 years ago, whether it's your ex-husband, whether it's your rebellious children, whether it's someone that hurts you. Because here's the thing. When it comes to people being familiar. We don't want, some of you who've been around at this church for a lot of time, especially on Sundays, you haven't even joined a small group yet because you don't want anyone to know that there's a sinner amongst the group. Let me tell you something. Your story of having things in your past you're ashamed of, that does not make you unique. You know why? Because I've got that story. And the person on your left has that story, and the person on your right has that story. That's not the unique thing. So please don't start, well, if anybody was like me, nuh-uh, we all are. All right? If anybody was like you, we are like you. The Pharisee was just like this woman. He just couldn't see it. The difference between the Pharisee and the woman is that she gets in on a relationship with Jesus, though she's got a really long list, and he, though he's got a short list, he misses out. And it says to us about the woman and the Pharisee, it says, she loved much because she was forgiven much. He didn't seem to love. And it says all the people at the table, right? It's like this dinner. It's not just the three individuals we see. It's other people at the dinner. And it says in verse 49, essentially that they were astounded and they began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sin? What word is pervasive over your life right now? What phrases? And this is not a self-help thing. I hope you know me better than that. But what words are you living out of? What words are defining you? Who you want to be or who you are or who God says you are? Listen, was she a sinner? Was that the end of her story? The question for us this morning isn't, are we like this woman? The question is, do we have to be forever? And will that be the end of our story? And if you're here this morning, it says about this woman that her faith essentially has saved her. Go in peace. Faith in who? Well, it can't just be this blind faith that I'm a better person than I think I am. No, her faith in the God represented by the person of Jesus who could forgive her. You and I need someone who can speak with authority and reality into our lives. My heart breaks for those of you that have allowed men, ladies, those of you that have allowed men to condemn you, to decrease your value, to decrease your worth. Men and women both in this room, those of us who hopefully you've had great parents, but some of you in this room, you've had parents that have decreased that. Some of you had a teacher, a coach, a professor. Some of you have had a pastor in the past that's done that. And I just want to say, hey, you can live out of that. And I know it's not easy to reject it. You can live out of that, or you can live out of the one who speaks a better word, who speaks a more authoritative word, the one who speaks with reality. If you would have seen what the woman had done with that expensive jar of perfume, not even using it in its intended use, it was something way beyond what she could afford. If you would have seen that, you would have thought, man, that is a waste. In fact, the disciples say that to Jesus in another story. You would have thought, man, that is so extravagant, unless you and I came to understand what she knew. She knew what it looked like for a holy God, full of grace, mercy, and compassion and forgiveness, to collide with her long list of sins. And so there was no price she wasn't willing to offer him. There was no value. She owned nothing that he couldn't have. Why? Because she knew her story. But she also knew that he came to reshape her story. And he's come to do the same for yours. And I would love to invite you into that this morning. Some of you are going to continue to live out of words that aren't true of you. And my prayer for you this morning right now is just that you would live in the reality that there's a God who loves you. He's very familiar with your sin. That might scare you at first. He's very familiar with your worst. And in light of that, he sent Jesus for you to bring peace between God the Father, who is holy, and you and I, who are sinful. No matter how many more messages God allows me to give in this church, I will not be able to give you any one more beautiful than this reality. Have you embraced it? Or are you living out of something that actually isn't true? Would you pray with me this morning?